Welcome to Lunch and Learn with Legacy Washington. I'm Bob Young, a historian with Legacy, which, like our colleagues at the State Library and State Archives, comes under the auspices of Secretary of State Kim Wyman. I would like to ask the audience to please mute your mics if you haven't done it already, and shut off your video. And for best viewing, if you select the active speaker format in the upper right corner, it's the first or the leftmost of the three buttons up there in the right corner. That should give you the best video. And I just want to let everybody know that we are going to save time for some Q&A. And so you can submit your questions to the chat bubble at the bottom of the screen. And without further ado, let us welcome today's guest, one of our favorite historians, Stephanie Coontz, educator, historian, author, with, by the way, very deep roots in the Olympia area. Stephanie is one of the trailblazing women who is profiled in our latest exhibit and book called Ahead of the Curve. She's an expert on family and marriage, known for debunking myths. Stephanie landed in the national spotlight in 1992 with her book, The Way We Never Were, which debunked many myths about the nostalgia that Americans have for the good old 1950s. Then she later wrote a book called Marriage, A History. It traced the evolution of marriage, essentially from cave dwellers to computer programmers. And it influenced the thinking of the United States Supreme Court in the 2015 landmark case legalizing same-sex marriage. Stephanie's work was cited twice by Justice Anthony Kennedy in his majority opinion. Let us just jump in, Stephanie. And thanks again for, I know that you're up early working, you've got some publishing deadlines that you're facing, but thank you for making some time. So you were recently quoted in Rolling Stone magazine about the pandemic, the reason we're doing this remotely instead of having a live event. And I was just curious what the pandemic's impacts have been on an area that you specialize in, which is families, and particularly its impact on working women who have reduced their work time to deal with it and reduced it more than.
Well, it's a very complicated thing, and the research is just coming in on it. I work with the Council on Contemporary Families and get these research and surveys that people are doing, some of which contradict each other. I think one of the problems is there's so many variations in this. Many women have been furloughed. Others have dropped out in order to stay home to do homeschooling. But women are actually a majority of the essential workers, people deemed essential workers out on the front lines and exposed to COVID-19. So there are some families where men have been furloughed and have to take over the childcare. Many families, though, in which this, especially the homeschooling, tends to fall on women. So it's hurtful to the cause of gender equality in several ways. But there's some good news. There's a little bright news hidden in here. For example, there was a piece of research that came out in the New York Times that many CCF researchers contributed to, Barbara Rissman, Jennifer Glass, some other very fine researchers. And what they found was that the pandemic had really increased women's work. And particularly, they honed in on homeschooling, and the different perceptions of men who said, well, we're doing most of the homeschooling or a good share, and the women who said, no, no, they're not. But then another CCF researcher did a study in which they ignored the question of homeschooling because not all people were doing it at the early parts of the pandemic. And they found that when it just came to housework and childcare, that actually people who had started sharing before, if men had started doing more before the pandemic, they upped their contributions after the pandemic. And so their take on it was that, well, yes, it is worsening the situation of all parents now, especially when homeschooling comes. And I have a particular take on the homeschooling that I'll add in a minute. But in the long run, they said this may work the way that we know from studies of paternity leave that it works once men do get exposed to the kind of work and the mechanics of it, but also the joys of it that they just were not attuned to in before. And for example, men who take paternity leave learn better how to do hands-on childcare. They do more housework. Years after they go back to work, the couples report that they argue less about housework because the man is doing more, that they are much more involved in childcare. So there may be some good long-term things. But the problem is that, for 200 years, and only for 200 years, this is important because people seem to think that male breadwinning families were forever and that women were always the primary nurturers. And that's not true. We can come back to that. But for almost 200 years, we've been nurtured to think that men need to concentrate on the breadwinning and shouldn't concern themselves with the details of housekeeping and childcare, and women are the experts in childkeeping. So even though the last 15, 20 years, men have increased their childcare contributions threefold, and they are doing more housework, not perhaps the same amount, I know not the same amount as women, but there is still this sense that if a new task comes along that's connected to supposedly traditional female roles, and we can have fun talking about those supposed traditions, that women should take it over. So homeschooling gets the worst of both worlds. It gives a totally new task to parents, and there is a tendency among couples, heterosexual couples, for the man to assume that the woman knows how to do it, and for the woman to assume, well, I'd better do it because he won't be able to. So there are a lot of changes that way. One of the other really difficult problems for women in this pandemic is the collapse of childcare. 60% of childcare companies or outlets closed down at the start of childcare. There's been a slight rebound. Well, this hurts women in two ways. First of all, more than 90% of childcare workers are female, and almost half of those are Black, Latino, or Asian. But secondly, so they're in trouble. And many of these businesses are small businesses owned by women, minority women as well, and they're going out of business and are in deep trouble. But to the extent that they're going out of business, the women and men who rely on them for childcare so that they can go out to work are in trouble too. So we don't know how long this pandemic crisis will last, but it's lasting a lot longer than we anticipated, and a lot of small businesses are closing down forever. So this is going to pose a real major social challenge for us. It could, in the best circumstances, be a good challenge, because maybe we'll stop paying childcare workers less than we pay parking lot attendants, and recognize that it is an important skilled job raising the next generation, helping to raise the next generation of workers. And we'll get affordable quality childcare the way many countries in Western Europe have done.
Thank you, Stephanie. Quick note, Stephanie mentioned CCF, and she is the Education and Research Director for that organization, Council on Contemporary Families, that is based at the University of Texas. It is one of the many hats Stephanie wears, such as being anti-bias advisor to MTV, and others. So Stephanie, I do want to come back to some of those the myths about traditional roles in marriage, but let's if we stay on the pandemic for a moment, you are, it seems to me, kind of an eternal optimist, even though you're fiercely intelligent, and and in your commencement speech to Evergreen grads, as in the Rolling Stone piece, you alluded to opportunities that the pandemic may provide. You referred to a crack in time. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I do try to look at possibilities. I try not to be a Pollyanna about things. And as I was constructing the commencement speech, I was asked to give this, and it was a little scary to be asked to talk to graduates graduating into this situation they're facing. I realized that I wanted to talk about how crises like these can be terrible, that they can smash so many things and they can go in so many terrible ways, but they also can operate. There's a line from Stephen Vincent Benet's famous book like poem, John Brown's Body, and talking about John Brown as having helped make a crack in time about the issue of slavery. He says, sometimes there comes a crack in time, sometimes the earth is moved by some unfathomable force, sometimes an image that has seemed implanted as the polar star is pushed against by that force that will not have it anymore. And so I wanted people to know that we have had these crises before. Sometimes they've turned out very bad, sometimes they've turned out good. During the Black Death, it turned out really bad in Eastern Europe, where the shortage of labor allowed the landlords in combination with a theocratic government to reimpose serfdom. But it turned out pretty well in Western Europe because there were these different, there was fragmentation of power that allowed serfs to move away and run away and just say, you know, I'm not going to put up with the feudal dues, and it basically destroyed serfdom. We had another pandemic, of course, in 1918, 1919. And by the way, I like to point out to people when they hear President Trump talking about the China virus and blaming it all on another country, that the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919 was actually the American flu. Researchers believe it started in Kansas and then was spread as a GI unit went over to World War I. So maybe we should not get too sanctimonious about this particular issue. But at any rate, the pandemic of 1918 to 1919 in Germany, it helped feed the rise of fascism. You had these right-wing politicians who, and I hope this doesn't sound too familiar, or maybe it should, who wanted to blame the virus on foreigners and socialists and all sorts of evil beings, and that helped the rise of fascism. But in Western Europe, it convinced most countries that they needed universal health care and a system that made everybody be able to get help when there was a virus so that nobody would have to catch it. So there's different ways that it can go. In America, Hoover ran for office on the promise of I'm going to return to normalcy. And the normalcy we returned to was widening economic inequality that reached a high point in 1929 and helped trigger the Great Depression. But that was another crisis in which we rose to the occasion. So I talked about that in my talk, and the reason that I kind of revisit it under your prodding here now is that I do think, I get, people are always asking people to predict the future. What we do now is what will determine the future. And so I just try to make people realize you can take horrible situations like this and use them as a force for positive change. You can reach out, win people over, and mobilize this kind of sentiment that makes it impossible to withstand. Or you can give in to the worst kinds of possibilities of human beings, because we got both going for us.
Yeah, and back to 1918-19, a quick plug for our Ahead of the Curve book. One of the women profiled in it, along with Stephanie, was a trailblazing Seattle physician, Mabel Seagrave, who went over to France thinking she was going to be treating wounded soldiers, but ended up treating more victims of the flu than battlefield wounds. Um, Interesting, Stephanie, something that you mentioned to me. There's a recent study done by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which found a correlation between the communities in Germany that had the highest death rates from the pandemic and those that in 1932 voted the most for the Nazis. So
Yeah.
just to reinforce Stephanie's point. Um, also, Stephanie, do you know why it was called the Spanish flu? I read something quite interesting.
Um, I'm usually good at picking facts out. I knew it someday, but it's gone
Uh,
right now.
well,
It's
what
off
I
the ether.
one thing I read is that so the Allied governments, if you will, were censoring information about the severity of the flu amongst the troops. And Spain, a so-called neutral country, had free press when it came to the severity of the flu. So it appeared to be more severe there than elsewhere. And that's, I believe, one reason, if not the main reason, why it was called the Spanish flu. Okay, so back to marriage.
Thank you.
Uh, Back to marriage and myths. Can you something you recently wrote about uh, was the original meaning and evolution of the title Mrs. Can you tell us what that original meaning was and how it evolved?
Well, it's fascinating to me to one of the things that happens is we're always told that these gender roles, we inherited them from evolutionary and we're kind of bound to them. But there is so much variation in history. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that I love studying history and talking about history is that we begin to see that we've got much more maneuvering room than we realize, that there's all sorts of different ways. Let me just give you a couple of examples before I get into the Mrs. one. There's this, I just happen to have been reading for a new essay book I'm putting together, all of this stuff about this idea that evolutionary psychologists have, that some of them have, that men are hardwired to like a particular body shape, and if you just don't go like, the curves and the small, the very small waist, well, this is what made them fit, and you're just out of the running. Well, as it turns out that when you show this kind of picture of this kind of ideal woman to somebody in a country that has not been watching Western television, they literally told the ethnographers, "Oh, she must have had diarrhea for several days. She must be ill." And we also know that men did not begin to prefer what we now think of as the delicate feminine features until the industrial era, as women moved out of their previous role in production. And it was a status symbol to have a wife who did not work outside the home and who did not have a tan if she, and had long fingernails because she didn't have to work alongside you the way wives for centuries did, when they were called yoke mates, because the idea was there was no such thing as a male breadwinner family. In fact, I have found letters and court cases of men in the 18th century describing themselves as a sole provider. But unlike the 20th century, when, a man who said this would say, "Well, I'm the sole provider for the family, I'm so proud of myself," they were complaining and asking for pity because their wife
Right.
could not or would not help. So that's a long-winded way to get to your
Yeah.
question.
Or didn't they have to apologize as well for being sole providers?
Well, oh yeah, well, they had to apologize because they couldn't get the work done that they
Right.
would have
Right.
had if they'd had their partner with them.
Right.
Yes. But Mrs. is very interesting because one of the things I don't think women and men have always been unequal, but it started very, very early. And it was certainly a very unequal patriarchal society in the Middle Ages. But people misunderstand what patriarchy is. In fact, I'm going to argue in an essay I'm beginning to write that fraternity is a stronger threat to gender equality today than patriarchy. Really, patriarchal systems are the rule of older men, and although they're male dominant, class and status and rank are so important that in many ways they outweigh gender. Men who are without status or without property in such societies are called boys for their entire life, and women who do have status and power, and this is where the long-winded answer to your question comes in, were uh, the patriarchs were masters, and a master was someone who governed other people, had to be obeyed. The exact equivalent of that was a mistress. A mistress was someone who ought to be obeyed. And just like Mr. was an abbreviation for master, Mrs. was an abbreviation for a mistress who had to be obeyed, who governed services. So it had nothing to do with her marital state. It had to do with her social status. And unmarried entrepreneurs in the 18th century were referred to as Mrs. It was only in the 19th century that Mrs. began to be claimed by women of lower status, and it became something that a woman began. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that that a woman lost her first name, and became what researchers call Mrs. Man, Mrs. John Doe, and part of that is because with the rise of a democratic society, a nominally democratic society, the old justifications of inequality had disappeared. So you can no longer say, some men are born to be kings, that's the way it is. Men rule over women normally, that's the way it is. So now, as they said, all men are created equal, with obvious footnotes. We don't mean black men, we don't mean Indians, well, and of course we don't mean women, but we have to understand that we now explain this in terms of their biological capabilities, and women can't do these things outside. They can't govern other people because they're not capable of it. They're such sweet little delicate things. They're great for nurturing, but they're just terrible at anything else. So this new ideology, which was completely connected to the rise of democracy and the idea of fraternity among men, is what I think made many women be proud to call themselves Mrs. Man. This shows that my claim to status, I can no longer claim it by my own actions in the outside world. I need to claim it through the actions of my husband.
But even if I'm not mistaken, even as late as 1968, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, his spouse was then referred publicly not as Coretta Scott King, but as Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh yeah. It was very. This is why. I mean, this just was just absolutely common in the 1960s when pollsters went around. When I was looking up some of the polls about marriage and family life, women would often say, well, they'd introduce themselves not by their own names, but by their husbands. And then they'd say, I can't talk to you until I've called my husband at work to find out whether I'm allowed to talk to you. And it's one of the reasons you said I was optimistic. I'm not sure I would say I'm just optimistic. I get very discouraged about some things, but I think one of the reasons that I sound optimistic to people who aren't historians is that when you see this kind of change and how repressive the 1960s was toward women and toward Blacks and Native Americans, you begin to see, wow, we have changed quite a bit when you take into account what a fairly short historical period this is. Mm-hmm. So yes, right up into the New York Times is is just reviewing their obituary comments, and two of the women who were doing that called me and asked, gosh, why was this being done? And that's how we got into a good long conversation about it.
Uh, let's take on one of those other myths. That is the tradition of the man as the breadwinner, the sole breadwinner, if you will, which you might think has been a role that men have occupied for centuries and centuries. Not true, says Stephanie Coontz.
Well, no, most families in history were working families. In farms, the wife didn't wait for the man to go out and bring home the bacon. She helped cure the bacon and raise the pig.
Probably helped
Um,
slaughter the pig.
yeah, exactly. And would, there was a division of labor by gender, but it was, anybody farm person will tell you that it has to be kind of flexible, given that kind of work. And in small businesses, and this is an interesting fact about marriage, you couldn't run a small in colonial America, they often wouldn't give an innkeeper or somebody like that a license unless he could prove he was married, because they knew he couldn't run on his own without a wife. Um, so, uh, so for many years, marriage was a union of, if it was not in the upper classes or the serfs, it was a union of two people who were going to run a business together, which is why male bakers married female bakers. Sons of bakers married the daughters of bakers, because they both had the knowledge to start a new business together. They could bring joint capital to the business. The same with shoemakers. So this was it, through most of history. If a man had to work, the woman had to work too. And this new ideal of male breadwinning grew up in the 19th century. We can come back at some point, if you want, to some of the ways that this deforms, I think, our ideas of love even now, with this new idea that men and women are opposites. The men do the providing and women do the processing and the nurturing and the comfort giving. Mostly it was an ideal more in the abstract, because most working families still required the labor of women, but increasingly women's labor stopped being counted. When you look at the supposedly low proportion of women in the workforce in like 1900 to 1920, there's actually a much higher one we can uncover, and we learn that women were working alongside they were they were taking boarders, they were working from the home, or they were helping finish products with the man. But they began to be pushed out of a formal recognition. And of course, for many working families, you can understand, with horrible working conditions, 6.5 days a week, often certainly 6 days a week, long working hours, terribly dangerous conditions. It began, if the middle class could actually afford to have their wives stay home and process the food and take care of the kids, that became an aspirational ideal for many working class men and women. But it's not until the 1920s that a bare majority of kids in America grow up in a household where the mother was not working alongside the husband or doing some other kind of work, and they were not working. Remember, child labor was also the norm. So but they were in school. And this was a family form that receded during the Depression and World War II, roared back in the extremely different, unique circumstances of the post-war era, hit its high point in about 1960, and has been receding ever since.
Right. And so the two maybe kind of crack in time events really drove women back into the workforce, the Great Depression and World War II, correct?
Well, the Great Depression actually drove many women out of the workforce,
Well,
because
that's
in the context of and here's another really interesting difference that shows you that we are changing, even if it's not as fast as many of us would like to change. During the Depression, there was this just hostility toward women who had to work. There was laws passed that if the man had a job, you couldn't hire the wife, you couldn't hire a man and a woman in the same employment, and the wife had to get out of the way of the men. And then when the war came, the women were allowed back to replace the men, but then they were pushed out of the jobs again after World War II. Now it's interesting to compare the Depression, where people were very hostile toward women workers, to the last recession that we had before the pandemic in 2008, when there was extreme gratitude in most families and in most people for the role that women played in helping the families survive by their work. So we're changing.
Mhm. Now, back to what you said, Stephanie, about ways in which the breadwinner role, I think you're referring to deformed love.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't. I'm not sure that there's any kind of ideal love in the past that got deformed. That might have been a misspeak. But I think that we developed a very new form of love in the 19th century that we're still grappling with today. As work moved out of the home, and as you got this new idea of democracy, which made women second-class citizens, but couldn't admit that they were second-class citizens, and had to say, well, this is because men are better at this and women are better at this on the love match. And this led to a lot of worry among people. How do we, first of all, how do we make sure that marriage lasts? If it's all based on love, how are we going to prevent people from not marrying if they're not fully in love, or from getting a divorce if they're in love? And the other sort of fear that came up is how do we keep women in their place in this kind of a period? And one of the ways that developed a new idea about male-female natures developed, I think partly as a conscious rationalization, but partly as unconscious, and women adopted it too, because it helped explain, okay, this is why I'm at home and this is why I should be happier at home. But this new idea developed that really doesn't have much basis in other historical periods, that men and women are opposites. Not that, in medieval world, women were, unless they were really in the upper classes, they were supposed to be kind of like men, but a little less than men, They were supposed to be able to do these things, but they were to understand that they were to take orders from men. And women were not considered to be some separate kind of being that should be looked up to. Women were considered much more sexually aggressive and prone to sexual error than men, for example. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, as we made this transition to a market economy and a certain limited kind of democracy, and had to explain that, a new ideal arose that, the reason that men and women occupy these different statuses is not because one is superior and one is inferior, but they are totally different. And this ideal arose of love as the engagement of opposites, that opposites attract. And we still function on that. Well, even though it's not actually true, opposites may excite temporarily, but they don't sustain love very well at all. And one of the things that I have been thinking about and increasingly writing about is the extent to which this idea that men and women are opposites, that men are, the people who go out and do the exciting things, but they're also a little dangerous because they don't deal with emotions, they deal with action. They have to be aggressive in order to, to make their way in the world. And women are the ones who provide emotions and sustenance and nurturing. And so this idea arose that marriage and love is how you unite. That's how you get access to the skills and resources and emotions of the other sex that you can't access on your own. And so as a result, women were kind of trained to fall in love with this man who was everything they could not be and could not understand. Dangerous, aggressive, dangerous, someone who might hurt them. But his ability to hurt them was the sign of what made him attractive as a male provider. Men, in turn, were told that that love was from a woman was admiration and willingness to be taught and comfort and allowing, being the one place that he could express some emotions that he's not allowed to express anymore. So, sometimes I think women learn to confuse anxiety and intimidation with erotic attraction, and men learn to confuse showing off with showing love because they were taught. So that's why I'm a little more sympathetic to mansplaining than many of my feminist friends. I say, "Oh, okay, okay, you think you're helping us out, but you're not." but it doesn't start out mean. So we both have this socialization that really stands in the way of what most of us now want from relationships, which is more egalitarian, respectful, friendship, give and take relationships.
I wasn't expecting to learn about the history of mansplaining there. Thank you. Uh, so, Stephanie, your work has traced the evolution of marriage, as we said earlier, from, I think, simply put, a unequal property contract to a gender-neutral bond of love. I wanted to ask you about a piece that you published in the New York Times recently with the provocative headline, "How to Make Your Marriage Gayer." Um, um, Stephanie Clement, the curse of so many writers. I didn't write the headline, but tell us about that piece. And it was based on a study of the home habits and relative happiness of gay, lesbian, and hetero couples. And what did it find?
Well, first of all, let me do two things. First of all, happiness is the wrong thing. I was able to get them to change the headline a little bit. They wanted to say why gay people are happier, and I said that's not what the studies that I'm reporting on show. But before we get there, let me just do a little detour because actually I trace the history of marriage, and I'm increasingly emphasizing this. From a pretty egalitarian way of spreading reciprocity to the development of a propertied unequal contract, and then from then again to a new form of egalitarianism. But I think it's important to recognize that marriage originally arose, and actually, as a feminist, I went into this kind of assuming that marriage had always been oppressive. But the more I studied the history of our earliest ancestors, the people who lived in foraging and hunting and gathering bands for 90% of our human existence, the more I realized that marriage was originally a way of creating fictive kin, in-laws. And when you look at even contemporary or foraging bands that we have records of, we find that in-laws, it's not just your brother's wife who's like your brother-in-law, it's your brother's wife's sister who is also considered an in-law in those. So in a sense, marriage becomes a way of just spreading obligations around. Then it changed the way you say. But okay, back to the gayer marriage. First of all, I should say, yeah, like you said, I didn't write that headline, and it was not any proof that marriages were happier overall. But one of the things that we've found, and I was collating the research of many other Council on Contemporary Family researchers and other people whom I quoted in the piece, one of the things we find is that this whole idea that men and women are opposites is getting in the way of how men and women arrange their childcare, their housework, the way they play with children, the way they understand their roles with each other. And gay and lesbian couples tend to do that a little better, that precisely because they find that they have more in common. A couple of examples. First of all, gay and lesbian couples don't come to the division of labor with this with this whole baggage that men do this and women do this. So they're more likely to sit down and talk about how should we divide this, and kind of drizzle it out so that it's not all gender. But you can't divide it just by gender if there's two genders in the home. And that leads to higher satisfaction, just the fact that they talk about it more. They incidentally talk about other issues like, do we want an open relationship or not, more than heterosexual couples do. And that this kind of talking about issues actually tends to be good for marriages. Another way in which they manage to do better than same-sex couples, different sex couples, is that I think it's because gays and lesbians, precisely because of the prejudice against them and not access to marriage, have a long tradition of communities and friendship, and not putting all their eggs in the basket of their partner relationships. And so researchers find that when gay and lesbian couples argue, they tend to be less defensive, less anxious about the final outcome of the argument than heterosexuals. They use more affection during the argument, they use more humor, and they recover more quickly. So this and many other things are really interesting examples of, not that everybody has to do it the same way, but that the more models we have out there for doing marriage and breaking with the idea that there's one, gender binary that has to organize the way we organize our lives and our emotions and everything, this is great for us. This is great for everybody.
Cool. Stephanie, I wanted to ask you, unless there's any more on the myths of roles in marriage you wanted to address.
Oh, well, I could do that forever, so let's just go on whatever you want. Okay.
Well, okay. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to tell the audience a little bit about the Council on Contemporary Families and the importance of its work.
Well, I feel, yes, thank you. The Council on Contemporary Families was founded, over 20 years ago, by a group of people from different research, sociologists, psychologists, a few historians like myself, some anthropologists, and people who've actually studied these family issues. And we would find ourselves meeting at conferences and going out for a cup of coffee or tea or glass of wine and complaining that the press was only quoting these ideological think tanks who didn't have trained family researchers on their staff. And the result was that the public was getting a very deformed view about what's happening in this period of very rapid change. So we decided that we wanted to be a group that could give the public that kind of information. And when we first started, I think this is interesting given the political climate right now, we had to fight over whether we should be the Council for Contemporary Families or the Council on Contemporary Families. And we decided that we needed to be someplace that press could come to and know that we would tell them both sides of the story, that we would take on liberal myths as well as conservative myths about the family. And so that's what we've done. And we have a lot of different members, and we try to exchange ideas about how to get this information out. And so it's just a wonderful place to collaborate with people from different disciplines, all of whom are generous about sharing their expertise and all have the same goal. Not how do I publish my little piece by myself, but how do we explain to people what's happening in families, hopefully in ways that will help them be better able to cope with the challenges they face.
Right, and not how to drive my ideological point home. This is a nonpartisan, research-based organization. And again, for folks in the audience who might be looking at some point for resources on understanding the kind of latest research on families, that's the Council on, not for, but Council on Contemporary Families.
Bob, just let me just say one
Sure.
thing. I think one of our favorite sayings at the council is, the important question today is not what kind of families you think people should be living in, but what do we know about the different families that people are living in and the different strengths and vulnerabilities that every family form has? There's no perfect family form. Okay,
Correct.
go on.
I wanted to ask you about one of your what seems to be more interesting credentials, and that is the anti-bias advisor to MTV. And you had, if I understood, had mentioned an example of the kind of advice you give them, and it had to do with how people perhaps misunderstand pay equity. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, well, MTV is now transitioning to a new thing. I've been there on this advisory board, but I'm not sure where we'll be working together in the future. But in the past, yes, they got pulled together an advisory board. They wanted to think about how they can educate their youthful audience about issues of race and gender and prejudice. And so they got together a bunch of researchers, including some older people like me, that they would then run ideas by. And I think when we were talking a while ago about it, I talked about the question of how you understand the gross versus the net reasons for the pay discrepancies between men and women. So if you look overall, women, they often say get 77 cents or 80 cents now for every dollar a man earns. But that doesn't mean that is what she's getting on the job. The actual pay differentials on the job have declined considerably. They still exist, especially in high wage occupations where there's more judgment, supposedly about people's skills, and you got the old boy network going. So gender inequality is higher in high wage occupations, even though economic inequality, women in those wages earn a hell of a lot more than men earning an average wage, but they earn a hell of a lot less than the men in their own peer group. But to get back to, for example, one of the things we had to work through, part of this is because women major in occupations that tend to be more traditionally female. Those occupations, in part because they are traditionally female, and there are these prejudices against it, get lower pay. So that's one of the reasons they earn less. Another is that it is still women who tend to take time off for family. And because of work breaks and stuff, it decreases their salary. So it's very important for us to unpack this. It makes a great statistic to say, oh, I only get 70% of what a man makes. But it doesn't get you very far once you begin to figure out how am I going to solve this? Because if I went and if I tell somebody that you're only making 77 cents and she goes to her employer and says, I want to make the dollar, the employer can prove to her that she's not making only 77 cents for and that's going to send her home feeling discouraged and feeling like the women's movement lied to her. So it's important that we be dead honest about what the complex things are that we're fighting here. That's all.
Great. I just want to remind the audience we're getting closer to the end of our program, and to submit your questions in the chat bubble. Well, we've got time for that. And I'm going to take this opportunity to make a quick plug for our Ahead of the Curve book that Stephanie's profiled in, along with 10 other trailblazing Washington women. And if you just go to the Legacy Washington website, Google Legacy Washington, you can quickly find how to purchase one of these. And I also want to put in a plug for our upcoming book. Our chief historian, John Hughes, has just completed a book about Congresswoman Julia Butler Hansen, who was a real trailblazer here in the state of Washington. I've read it. It's great, and you should look forward to that as well. I'm going to field one of the questions here that's been sent to me. Um, Great question. As the new Stephanie, as the new concept of love emerged and marriage roles changed, have you seen a change in perspectives on marital fidelity and adultery?
Mhm. Well, that is a very interesting question because as people know, there are more couples discussing polyamory and other kind of possibilities. But here's an interesting paradox that as marriage has become more voluntary and more egalitarian, actually more people uh, are sort of are actually hostile to infidelity than ever before in the past, and that makes sense in a certain way. It depends how you define infidelity. So the same people might be willing to say, if you have agreed that you're going to have an open marriage, that's fine. But if you have not agreed that, then there is no excuse for not keeping the commitment to be faithful. And people hold couples, both male and female, and especially males who always got a pass in in the past, to higher standards of fidelity, precisely because we know that you can divorce if you're not getting along. That we have plenty of time to make up our time and sow your wild oats, so to speak. So the two things coexist and they're not contradictory. More tolerance of people making alternative arrangements to monogamy, but less tolerance for people violating monogamy if that's the spoken or unspoken agreement.
That is interesting. Um, Stephanie, while we're getting another question our way, I just wanted to ask you about um, the a piece you did for NBC News about a very well-known couple who would seem to be publicly also at loggerheads, and that is Kellyanne and George Conway. Kellyanne, the counselor to President Trump, and George Conway, an outspoken critic of President Trump. And based on what you know about the predictors of sustaining a marriage, what did you have to say about the prospects for Kellyanne and George?
Well, I tried very hard to actually avoid making any predictions because I am not a psychologist and I'm certainly not a Dr. Phil who practices psychology, at arm's length or TV length or whatever. What I did was I did point out that this could be all part of, the kind of cynicism of American politics today. I mean, I remember that Kellyanne Conway came home once told friends that she'd come home after defending something and saying she had to take a bath. So God knows whether she really believes what she says about Trump or just thinks it's good pay job, it's a good gig.
Good gig.
So I don't know about that. You've got Mary Madeline, and you have these other couples who do this. On the other hand, it's important to recognize that real ordinary people who are not playing, these games and publicity stunts, really require respect in a way I think that they didn't in the past. I really do think that back in the 50s and 60s, you could fall in love with a gender stereotype and be pretty happy. I mean, I have literally had people I interviewed and I asked them, what was it that you saw in your wife or your husband? And the wife would say things like, well, he never really understood my emotions, but he's such a good provider, good dad. And the guy would say, well, I can't talk to her about my work, but oh my gosh, she's such a nurturing mom, and she's just such a good cook, uh, and so, but nowadays that's just not going to cut it. Men and women expect, in a heterosexual relationship, they expect to they hope in some ways to know each other the same way that same-sex people can know each other, to be friends in that same way. And respect is absolutely critical. And I think in that NBC piece that I wrote a while ago, I probably quoted the research by John Gottman, the psychologist up at the University of Washington, who talks about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And that is the kind of things that really destroy marriage: defensiveness, aggression, the idea that, you always, those kind of generalizations. But a big one is contempt. If you find yourself rolling your eyes, not fun, not fun rolling. Like my husband will sometimes say things and I'll go like this in front of him. But if you're rolling your eyes behind your partner's back, that is a very bad sign. And if George feels the contempt that he does for what Trump is doing, and Kellyanne actually believes it and is not just playing a game, then I think, oh dear, I don't want to be Dr. Phil here, but I think that probably would be a danger.
Okay. A question, Stephanie, in our remaining time, I really want to get to you, and that is one of our audience members asked, what are you reading now?
I read, well, this is embarrassing to answer. I wish I didn't
because you have a farm to run.
But I'll be honest. I do so much reading of research reports, and one of the joys of my work at the Council on Contemporary Families is I'm always reading research from other researchers or about to be published articles, looking for things that, buried on page 10 is something that I think the public would really like to know. Let's go write a research paper on that. So I do that all day. And so when it comes to night, I read junk. I read mystery novels.
Oh, tell us more. What kind of junk?
Just mystery novels. I mean, it's interesting. If I've got an extra minute here, I spoke at a couple conferences about romance novels, which are being rediscovered by some researchers, and they're talked about as, and I have never been interested by romance novels. They just completely leave me cold. But as I looked at what people were getting from romance novels versus what I get from a mystery novel, you read a real novel, a good novel, in order to be surprised and challenged. You read a genre novel in order to comfort yourself. So romance novels are reading to get back to what we talked about earlier about love. For a woman, it's like, here's this dangerous man who can hurt me, from Jane Eyre to 50 Shades of Grey. That's what it's about. He can hurt me, but I might be just the person who can make him suspend that danger and really appreciate me as an individual. And that's a comforting thing to think about for many. What I get out of mystery novels, I think, is there's a mystery. The bad guy gets caught. The intellectual problem is solved. The bad guy gets caught, or at least identified. And I particularly like the ones with female heroines because although they have romances, romance is not the ending. You can't have a reappearing female detective in a novel who settles down and gets married. So even though I'm married myself, that appeals to my sense that there are bigger things than marriage in life. So it's junk novels. I mean, sometimes I'm so tired at the end of the day, I can only read 3 pages. So working through George Eliot would be difficult.
It's hard when you read all day. I can relate. So, Stephanie, we're near the end of our hour. I just want to take the opportunity to thank you again. We've got some great comments coming in from the audience, including somebody who said they could listen to you all day. So much fluency in history and the ability to explain complex social structure in an engaging manner. So,
oh, well, that's nice. Thank you, whoever you are.
and thank you again, Stephanie, and thanks to the audience and TVW, and we will look forward to our next Lunch and Learn with Legacy Washington. And it's only too bad that you can't come see the lovely exhibit because the Capitol building or the building as it's known, is closed to the public. But when it reopens, we've got this wonderful museum quality exhibit on the walls of the Secretary of State's office, and I would encourage you to come down and visit. Thanks again, Stephanie, and thanks to everyone for joining us. It's been a real treat. And with that, good day, all.